Good afternoon, and thank you for joining today's webinar. My name is Jennifer Cooley, and I am the Education and Outreach Manager for the State Historical Museum of Iowa. The Iowa History 101 webinars, presented on the second and fourth Thursdays of each month, explore Iowa's history from pre-statehood to current day. You can learn more about this series and all of our programs on our website at iowaculture.gov. Please remember to sign up for each webinar you would like to attend, and don't worry if you can't watch live. All presentations will be recorded. Today, we will explore Iowa through divergent views of two artists. When Russell Lee traveled to Iowa in December 1936, he might have expected to find something out of the Grant Wood paintings. Instead, the photographer in the employ of Roosevelt's New Deal found a very different scene of destitute farmers facing a hardscrabble existence. A few housekeeping points before I introduce our speaker. Everyone came into this webinar on mute with cameras off. Closed captions are available by clicking the closed caption button on your screen. The webinar is being recorded and will be placed on the Iowa Culture page of YouTube in a few days. I have disabled the chat function, but if you have any questions, please type them into the Q&A feature throughout the webinar. My colleague Matt Beyer is watching that feature and will prepare a list of questions for the speaker at the end of the presentation. But please note, we may not be able to get to all of the questions. Now I'm pleased to introduce our presenter, Dr. James Swensen. James is an associate professor of art history and the history of photography at Brigham Young University. His research interests include documentary photography, the art and photography of the American West, and the Grand Tour of Italy. He is the author of several articles and two monographs, Picturing Migrants, The Grapes of Wrath, and the New Deal documentary photography, and In a Rugged Land, Ansel Adams, Dorothea Lange, and the Three Mormon Towns Collaboration, 1953 to 1954. He also co-authored Returning Home, Dene Creative Works from the Intermountain Indian School. And now I'm very happy to turn over to James to begin the webinar.
Well, thank you, Jennifer. Again, thank you for this invitation. It's a privilege to be with all of you today. And I'd also like to thank Andrew Koop, who published. So I'm going to be talking about, my presentation actually comes out of an article that I published in the Annals of Iowa. So I'd like to thank Andrew for his help on that and for this generous invitation. I really appreciate it. My presentation today is called Uncommon Ground, Grant Wood and Russell Lee's Divergent Views of Iowa. And I begin this with a disclaimer. I am a Utah kid. I'm through and through a Westerner. So I need to apologize ahead of time if I pronounce Iowa names incorrectly. I look forward to a good conversation after and questions and answers. So if there are things that I need to know or individuals you recognize or whatever it may be, I would love to carry on those conversations. So it may not surprise you that this presentation today starts with this image, one that you probably know very well at this point. This is the logical place to start. And Grant Wood's American Gothic, as you know, has been reproduced, parodied, and lampooned probably more than any other painting in American history. As scholars like Wenda Corn have argued and observed that the scene of an Iowa farmer and his daughter, sometimes erroneously seen or thought to be his wife, has really proven to be remarkably adaptable for nearly a century. So here's just some of the ways in which it's been used. My personal favorite of late is this one, a nice nod to the selfie. But I have to admit too that I even made the pilgrimage to Eldon as well. So here's a portrait photograph of me and my young daughter, probably about 4 or 5 years ago. So this painting, its history, and its legacy really do have a draw. There is, though, a place I would like to start. An early example of the way in which this image was adapted was made by a young Black photographer named Gordon Parks. And this was created for the Farm Security Administration, or the FSA, under the aegis of the administrator, Roy Stryker. And in this example, as you can see, Parks substituted Wood's Iowans with the African-American charwoman who scrubbed the floors of the New Deal office. He intended this photograph to be a protest against racial and social injustice, which Parks not only saw, but also experienced in Washington, D.C. And when asked about this photograph, he admitted that he posed his subject, whose name was Ella Watson, in what he called, quote, a Grant Wood style. And it's that idea of a Grant Wood style that is going to be important to my discussion, my presentation today. Park's caustic remaking of Wood's most iconic image was not the only time that the Iowa artist influenced the photography of the New Deal. In December 1936, Stryker sent Russell Lee, his newest photographer, to Iowa to record the plight of poor families across the state. This presentation today examined Lee's work in Iowa and how it was influenced by Wood and his vision of the state. Lee was a trained artist with deep connections to regionalist painters and themes, and his series reflected a sustained engagement of this Grant Wood style that was directly and indirectly connected to the Iowa artist. Roy Stryker's historical section, which was the name of the photography section, was nearly 2 years old when Russell Lee was hired in October 1936. Still part of Franklin Delano Roosevelt's controversial resettlement administration, or the RA, Stryker his job was to highlight his agency's activities, which sought to help help American farmers create better farms on better land. Here's a propaganda poster for the administration. But Stryker, who you see on your right here with his photographs, John Vachon, Arthur Rothstein, and Russell Lee, knew what his task was. And I'm going to give you a quote here. He said this, quote, "My photographers go from the rich lands of Iowa to the Mississippi Delta to the state of California, north, south, east, and west. The lens follows the destitute man." And over the course of the 7 years of Stryker's historical section, his team of photographers made some of the most iconic images of the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl in particular. You may recognize this one from Arthur Rothstein, which was made in Cimarron County in Oklahoma in 1936. And I guarantee that you've probably seen this one at some point, Dorothea Lange's famous Migrant Mother, which was made in a poor pea-picking camp in Nepoma, California in March of 1936. With its focus on rural America, FSA photographers like Lange and Rothstein shared common ground with regionalists like Grant Wood. Yet for various reasons, these two groups were not seen in the same light. Unlike photography, which was not generally seen as an art form at the time, regionalism functioned within the discourse of fine art and was dominated by painters like specifically the three of the most famous, Grant Wood, Thomas Hart Benton, and John Stuart Curry. Together, despite their differences, however, regionalists and FSA photographers were linked together in their focus on the American scene, as you can see in this great old photograph by Walker Evans. Together, they were interested in depicting and delineating distinctive American communities and cultures that existed across the country. Grant Wood. Grant Wood's American experience was centered in Iowa, as you well know. The state, with its rolling hills, cornfields, and broad rivers, was his home and his center. Like Roy Stryker, Wood played up his provincial roots, and even though he had extensive experience abroad and in urban centers, he still played up the idea of being an Iowan. As he matured as an artist, his attachment to Iowa subjects deepened as his commitment to place echoed in a broader regionalist ethos. When Wood exhibited American Gothic at the Art Institute of Chicago in the fall of 1930, months after it was finished, it became an instant success. As Matthew Pygel observes, it was the right painting shown at the right time and in the place. For various reasons, its subject matter, featuring austere farm folk, resonated with American audiences who were racked by economic uncertainty. Quite unexpectedly, it became famous at home and abroad and was reproduced in papers and periodicals across the country. It was certainly known in Stryker's office. Wood, too, was widely acclaimed. The WPA Guides to Iowa proudly pronounced that its native son was a genius who, quote, ranks as the outstanding artist of the state among distinguished painters of America. Lee was born in Ottawa, Illinois in 1903 to a family with means and rooted to the land. And we'll discuss a little bit more about this later. After a challenging upbringing in which he witnessed the death of his mother, among other trials, Lee obtained a degree in chemical engineering from Lehigh University, but shifted his energies toward painting and art in 1929. This transformation was propelled by his marriage 2 years earlier to the regionalist painter Doris Emmerich, who, as Doris Lee, would be known for a seemingly homespun style that often focused on rural life. Together, the two traveled to museums in Europe for their honeymoon and then went on to study at Kansas City and San Francisco. In 1931, they moved to New York, where they both studied at the Art Students League during the winter, and then moved upstate to the Woodstock colony in the summer. During their studies across the country, they befriended a number of important artists and who they counted as friends, including Diego Rivera, Stuart Davis, and John Sloan. It could be easily argued, in fact, that the easiest influence at this stage in his career on Russell Lee in the 30s was his wife. More advanced and gifted as a painter than he was, Doris also fostered a deep interest in America, and as she'd like to call for its variety of all things. Like Wood, she celebrated rural America and its customs and cultures in her work, and acknowledged that most modern painters are coming down to earth, interpreting common people and common scenes. This is clearly demonstrated in probably her most famous painting, Thanksgiving from 1935, a scene of bustling preparations in a country kitchen, which received the prestigious Logan Purchase Prize from the Art Institute of Chicago in 1935. Like American Gothic, the painting resonated with American audiences and for a time rivaled it in popularity. One commentator, in fact, called Thanksgiving, which you see here, as, quote, a comic Valentine of US farm life, unquote, while another likened it to a happy, festive bit of domestic genre. Although Russell Lee nor his biographers have made the connection to Grant Wood, there were connections. They were acquaintances, and Lee would have known of Wood's work. The Lees and Wood were members of the same artistic circles, and Doris and Wood, we know, were friends. They both were represented by Maynard Walker Gallery in New York City, and in the summer of 1934, both Doris and Russell were among the 20 artists who met in Benton's Manhattan studio that led to the establishment of the Associated American Artists. Doris Lee was also one of the last friends to visit Wood prior to his death in 1942. Around the same time as his wife's career was progressing, Russell Lee confronted the reality that his own work was stagnant. There's not a lot of paintings you can still see by Lee, but those that you can see reveal that he wasn't a very good artist. So encouraged by his friend Ben Shahn, Lee turned to photography, and in a remarkably short amount of time became proficient in photography and all of its processes, and began to channel his energies in this new medium. He was soon out of the studio, photographing the dire straits of those living on the streets of New York, like you can see here, and even ventured into the coal mining camps of Pennsylvania. In the summer of 1936, the painter Joe Jones informed Lee of work of Stryker's historical section, and that autumn, Lee introduced himself to Stryker and was quickly hired when one of Stryker's photographers went to work for Life magazine. Although eager and enthusiastic, Lee's experience with photography was limited. For nearly a decade in Woodstock, San Francisco, and New York City, he was integrated into the world of American art. He was not only married to a regionalist, but he knew the regionalists, their interests, and their work. With the move to Washington, D.C., however, Lee underwent another important transformation, which I think you can see here by these photographs of him. Here we have Lee right about the time in which he was leaving art and becoming interested in photography. And here you have a photograph of Lee and its transformation, that now he is a photographer with his camera like slung around his neck. It's almost as if his entire persona and demeanor, in fact, have changed. Lee's first assignment was in New Jersey. For his second assignment, Stryker sent his new employee on the road to the Midwest. Offering suggestions and encouragement throughout his travels, Stryker was eager to see what Lee could do. Traveling alone by car, Lee made his way west in the end of November. His base for his assignment in the Midwest was his mother-in-law's home in Aldo in northeastern Illinois, from where he ventured into Iowa. To get to the state's remote communities, Lee traveled hundreds of miles on icy and snowpacked roads. to junction towns and isolated farms in northern, central, and western Iowa. This, in fact, is a hand map, and in fact, all the demarcations are from Lee, showing you where he was going. December 1936 was not as cold as the previous year, one of the coldest months on record, but it was still bitterly cold with an average temperature of 28 degrees and a low of 16 degrees below zero. The conditions were so cold that it often froze the shutter on Lee's handheld 35mm camera. Despite the weather, Lee's investigation focused on Dickinson, Emmett, Clay, and Palo Alto counties in the northwestern portion of the state. He also worked in Woodbury, Crawford, and Monona counties in western Iowa, which featured the greatest number of farm families eager to receive emergency grants from the RA and the Work Progress Administration, or WPA. And you can actually, again, see on this map that Lee sent back to Stryker where he was planning on visiting. The winter conditions that Lee experienced presented a perfect backdrop to highlight the poverty and destitutions he was sent to photograph. Lee's wintry scene stood in contrast with Wood, who focused more of his attention on painting verdant landscapes and idealizing Iowa's seasons. According to Wood, here in Iowa, the winters are severe, heaven knows, but even in the height of winter, one does not get the feeling of utter bleakness and desolation that is characteristic of Dakota, for example. The farmhouses are snug, the barns are well stored. It is a land of plenty, where here, which seems to rest rather than to suffer under the cold, unquote. I hear that it's cold and snowy in Iowa, so I'd be curious to get your take on Grant Wood's quote. As scholar James Dennis observed, Wood transformed Iowa, even in the winter, into a world of well-being. On the treeless plains of northern Iowa, Lee experienced the opposite of a rural paradise, spending the month recording farm folk who were hampered, as you can see in this couple, by the many ills not found in Wood's depiction of the state. He learned that this part of the state was different from the painter's depiction of eastern Iowa's rolling hills and fertile fields. The Corn Belt may have been seen as the gift to the gods, but by the mid-30s, it seemed to have fallen out of grace. With the precipitous decline of American agriculture following the record highs during World War I, farmers all across the Midwest were falling into debt and farm tenancy. Plummeting farm prices and overpricing drastically affected Iowan farmers more than a decade before the crash of the stock market in 1929. Hardship was exacerbated by droughts in 1930, 1934, which was reported to be the worst in history, and again in 1936. By that year, Iowa farmers had already experienced what Wallace Farmer, a periodical called, quote, long years on the downgrade, unquote. Indeed, by the time Lee arrived in Iowa, nearly half of all its farmers, or 49.5%, were cash renters, and more than 70% of the state's farm real estate did not belong to those who were working the land. These conditions helped make Iowa the logical place to explore the problems of farm tenancy, in an effort to support the passage of the Bankhead-Jones Act, which sought to ameliorate the desperate conditions of tenant farmers. Stryker sought photographs of tenant farmers from all of his photographers. It became clear, however, that Lee's work in Iowa would be exactly what his boss had demanded. Quote, "We will be able to use everything we can get," Stryker told his photographer. And continuing this quote, "The New York Times, Des Moines Register, and other papers are hollering now for anything we can get a hold on of farm tenancy." Excuse me for a second. To fulfill the need of his agency, Lee worked feverishly across Iowa. During his 3 weeks in the state, he covered hundreds of miles and visited over 60 families. Here's the map again. Many of these families were tenants, and he learned how they're beholden to loan companies, absentee capital, and private individuals. Not all those he met were tenants, but he found that many of those who maintained ownership of their farms were also heavily in debt. J.E. Hebronson, for example, owned a farm near Esterville that was heavily mortgaged and in general disrepair, as you can see in Lee's photograph here. He was already 1 year behind on his payments and facing another round of poor crops and high interest rates. Whether tenant or owner, Lee learned that Iowa farmers were growing increasingly desperate, having not had crops for many years, which was a quote that one farmer gave to Lee. There were, however, other possible contradictions in Lee's focus. His assignment was to document tenant farmers and their plight for the federal government with a sympathetic eye that could garner support for their assistance and cause. Yet Lee was connected to this work in tangled ways. As Lee's biographer, Mary Jane Apple, has pointed out, Lee was an absentee owner. Through inheritances, he owned several farms in Ottawa, Illinois, that provided him with financial security and a comfortable living. His income, in fact, enabled him to travel abroad, abandon chemical engineering, and gave him the opportunity to pursue a life of art and photography. Although he was attentive and involved landlord, working among Iowan tenant farmers must have put his role in sharper focus. He did acknowledge that there were good landlords from other states, but as part of the system, he was complicit. To a degree, in the inequalities he observed among tenant farmers in Iowa. And yet his complicated link to farm tenancy did not seem to obstruct his desires to expose inequalities and poverty for Stryker and for the resettlement administration. Sent to document hardscrabble realities, Lee created work in Iowa that presented a challenge to Wood's homespun realism. His photographs of poor tenant farmers ran counter to Wood's portrait of the state with its rectangular fields, red barns, white farmhouses, grain elevators, and church spires, rich soil, and prosperity. Wood's lush landscapes were not what Lee discovered in a cold, bleak December. In this series, Lee broke with an idealized depiction of the American scene to reveal its more painful realities. This was particularly true of his coverage in northern and western Iowa, which was known to have suffered more severely than any other part of the state. In creating his own portrait of Iowa, Lee had a special challenge. As Stryker points out, he came to this project at a point where there were already precedents for producing remarkable photographs, some of which I showed you early on. And he was going to have to equal, match, or better the work that was already in the files. Lee also had to match the pictorial tradition that he knew. While working in Iowa, he not only needed to produce work on par with people like Walker Evans, Dorothy Lang, and Arthur Rothstein, but he also must have felt that he needed to respond to Grant Wood. Years earlier, in fact, he ceased calling himself an artist. At this stage in his career, he had more in common with art than photography. He was an artist first and a photographer second. While he would go on to be known as a cataloger of facts and a taxonomist with a camera, in 1936, he was closer in proximity and in training to regionalist painting than he was to documentary photography. It would have been difficult for a regionalist turned photographer working in Iowa not to be influenced by the famous painter. This may be observed in Lee's work in Iowa, where the presence of Wood as an artistic incarnation of the rural Middle West would find reference and resonance in his photographs from his first assignment in the field. Because he knew Wood's work, Lee had the opportunity to frequently reference the well-known painter, as well as to present an opposing viewpoint. For those who knew Wood's work, it was possible to see echoes in the countryside. For example, a reoccurring motif in Wood's Iowan landscapes is the presence of corn shocks. Wood, in fact, loved the reoccurring pattern of triangular groupings of discarded corn stalks after the harvest, which dot the landscape, probably most famously in this painting titled Fall Plowing. Lee also photographed similarly stacked sugarcane stalks in Emmett County, which he noted were used as animal fodder. Sugarcane was not a primary crop in this region, and one of the reasons to photograph the repeating canonical forms may be more visual quotation than administrative need. One of the clearest ways, though, to see a connection between Wood and Lee's photographs is of local art and folk traditions. From the very beginning of his career with Stryker, Lee photographed a wide variety of objects, such as handmade signs, folk paintings, crafts, and family portraits. Indeed, his boss wanted him to record, quote, the Americana of the times, unquote. But it also stemmed from Doris Lee, his wife, who was interested in and a collector of folk art, which also informed her faux naive style. Wood, too, was known for his interest in items with distinctive American qualities, or the bits of American things that are too good to lose, he said. He took inspiration from a wide variety of objects, including Currier and Ives prints, frontier photographs, old maps and atlases, folk paintings, and quilts, as you can see in his ornamental decoration. Wood was particularly interested in furniture and even created his own designs and an ottoman for purchase. Lee's interest in documenting folk expressions was on display in a number of ways, including this photograph of a painting in a home, but also this one in Anawa. I apologize if I'm pronouncing that wrong. He photographed a primitive landscape painting under a pressed tin ceiling in a cafe. The work of a local painter, it presented a landscape that was closer to the Swiss Alps than in Iowa's rolling hills and plains. Lee and his wife also shared an interest in ordinary everyday objects like old-fashioned stoves and furniture. While documenting the 286-acre farm of Fred Rowe in Esterville, he recorded a distinctive, what we called early American rocking chair outside and seemingly out of context. By singling out the chair with his camera, he highlighted the Eastlake platform rocker's originality and craftsmanship. It may have been its form or its bobbin pin spindles that attracted the attention of Lee, especially when it was placed against the whitewashed clapboards of the house. Lee's interest in the simple order and detail of objects is probably best illustrated by this photograph of a humble washstand in the home of Harry Madsen, a hired hand living near Dickens. Presented in natural light, Lee's photographed a jubilant mixture of patterns and textures found in homely details, from the polka dot cupboard to the floral wallpaper, enameled basin, and the modern rug on the floor. Lee clearly delighted in the scene, which would have been at home in one of his wife's paintings. However, this image too did not convey the desperation that he would later document. While working in the Rowe home, again, which I mentioned earlier in Esterville, Lee also photographed 2 old portraits of the family ancestors in matching frames. Lee often photographed family portraits in people's homes as a way of establishing a connection between past and present. These were objects he believed of historical value. Responding to one subject, Lee said, quote, "The picture of your mother and father there," pointing to one of their photographs, "is of a certain period. I want to take your picture because that is going to be of a certain period too. It is going to be of today, which is going to be of tomorrow's history," unquote. Yet there is likely another reason why he was drawn to the photograph of the woman in the independent portraits, which I would argue easily could be seen as a visual reference to American Gothic. From the woman's tight-necked shirt held together tightly by a circular cameo to the matching hair parted precisely down the middle, this figure might as well be the same woman, now slightly aged, who appeared in Wood's most famous painting. Instead of averting her gaze, however, this woman remains stridently fixed upon the viewer. While the ancestor row may have been the most direct connection to Wood, it is not the only way in which Lee's photographs referenced Wood's most famous painting. If Lee was looking for tenant farmers still clinging to their land, he found them during his travels. During his research in the field and his ability to secure the trust of his subjects, Lee was able to photograph a number of farmers, record their names, and learn of their situations. On 12 separate occasions, Lee documented husbands and wives standing in front of their homes. When seen together, these portraits take on a, quote, Grant Wood style that I mentioned earlier. Indeed, there is a consistent resemblance to American Gothic in these portraits. And while not uncommon in Lee's work, the number of times he posed couples in such a short period of time in one state is unique in the FSA archive. Shortly after his arrival on the public stage, Grant Wood's painting of American Gothic people was seen as an authentic social document, despite the fact that it was a painting. Lee would take this further by co-opting American Gothic basic elements of a husband and wife, or a man and a woman standing side by side in front of their home. His photograph presented a very different vision of Iowa than Wood created only 6 years earlier. Rather than modest, sun-drenched prosperity, Lee recorded actual Iowans struggling through the winter and economic uncertainty. In his couple portraits, Lee recorded men and women standing shoulder to shoulder, directly in front of the camera. Some maintained stern appearances, while others watched the photographer without expression. Others were nervous or even quizzical. The Aldriches, who you see here from Ruthven, smiled gleefully into the camera. 4 of the couples were photographed up close and cropped like American Gothic, which presented a better opportunity to see facial expressions. This is probably best illustrated in the unyielding portrait of Mike Maloney and his wife, in which the man resolutely stares into the camera, much like Wood's farmer. There seems, however, to be more desperation than strength in their situation, as Lee noted that the couple from Denison were, quote, buying groceries on credit with no reserve of resources. During his tenure in Iowa, Lee observed that there were many of these farmers were on the breaking point. Writing to Stryker, Lee commented on the dire conditions facing young farmers and on the volatility of the situation. Quoting Lee here, quote, in the opinion of these local farmers, there is danger of an uprising among families here unless immediate aid is forthcoming, unquote. This was not an isolated incident. He heard threats of uprising across Crawford and Woodbury counties. Maloney's direct gaze, again, going back to this photograph, may reflect underlying tensions. 3 years earlier, the community of Denison experienced a farm riot that witnessed 800 farmers overtaking and injuring local sheriff deputies before a military guard arrived. Presuming that the Maloney's portrait was representative of the community, the situation had not improved. Most of Lee's couples, the couples he photographed, were captured from a distance, which made it possible to gain a greater sense of context. The photographs reveal that Iowan farm couples were wearing, and it reveals what they were wearing. The men, characteristically, wore overalls, or what James Agee called the standard working garment of the American farmer, which they wore under jackets like Wood's central figure. Women donned patterned dresses as well as winter coats and working aprons. They wore winter boots or scuffed work shoes. In most cases, their clothing was piebald and worn. As Mrs. Warren Johnson, an Iowa farm woman at the time, noted, overalls and cotton dresses, again, are the mark of a farmer, and they are well patched. The distance between photographer and his subjects gave a greater sense of how these people were living by providing additional insight into their housing situation. It was reported that the homes of Iowa farmers were some good and some not so good. This was evident in the series, in which houses ranged from sturdy clapboard side homes to tar paper shacks. In Iowa, Lee found that many tenant farm homes were overcrowded and in a state of decay. Furthermore, nearly 82% of all homes did not have running water or electricity. Lee's wider view also made it possible to gain a greater sense of their living conditions among the snow and ice and debris and disorder along with the occasional dog at their feet. And yet, while the photographs provide a wider view of life on a tenant farm, they did not make other links to Wood's images. His couples, for example, do not hold tools like a pitchfork, which was already seen as old-fashioned. In fact, they relied instead on mechanical hanging equipment and tractors that were to be found beyond the picture frame. Let's see. While audiences were and still are surmising at Wood's intent in American Gothic, Lee provided a greater picture through captions that reveal the difficulties these farm families were facing. Mr. Roundhauser, a father of 7 who you can see here, was out of work and looking for relief. The Marriotts of Esterville were to lose their farm to a private loan company. This was the 3rd farm that they had lost in 10 years. Despite their difficulties, however, Mr. and Mrs. Marriott continue to smile. In his notes, Lee made it clear that the federal government was assisting many of these farmers. The Freddys from Armstrong were to receive relief from a resettlement loan despite their tenant status. He made it known, however, that even relief was not enough. The Bantas Lee reported, only had 10 days of groceries, after which they were going to have to sell off their livestock, which they used their WP loans on to help pay for feed. Standing in front of their tar-papered home, the Banta's nervous expression illustrate their downtrodden economical spiral. The most pitiful of Lee's American Gothic-like farm couples was undoubtedly Andrew and Teresa Ostermeyer from near Otto, a small farming community outside of Sioux City. German immigrants from Bavaria, the Ostermeyers were homesteaders who knew loss. They had 5 children, the last three of which did not survive to adulthood. They also lost one farm in Harrison County after World War I and were unable to maintain their second farm on the Little Sioux River nearly 2 decades later. The year 1936, as their granddaughter recalled, was, quote, was the year we dried out. We didn't raise any crops at all, unquote. Unable to repay their loan, they were in the process of eviction when Lee found and photographed them. Teresa was 74 and her husband was 81. The series of 6 photographs that Lee made showed the couple as emblematic of elderly poor across the United States who had to rely on family for work and support. In Lee's first images of the diminutive couple, they stand helplessly in front of their simple farm home as their furniture was being brought out. The photographer then famously focused his lens on the weathered, hardened hands of Teresa, which you can see here. In her hands, it is possible to see grim beauty. These hands that knew pain, toil, drudgery, as well as rough cloth of corn stalks, of hay forks, handles, of ropes and reins. They knew the feeling of cold rain, the frost and sunshine, and newly turned soil. They knew the softness of a baby's skin. For critic Elizabeth McCausland, this image was more than a photograph. It was, quote, a human and social document of great moment and moving quality, unquote. Lee's images of Ostermeyer's hands also provide an insightful comparison to Wood's portrait of his mother, titled Woman with Plants. When he painted his mother, Hattie Weaver Wood, who died in 1935, the painter paid particular attention to her worn, fragile hands. However, there's a softness and tenderness seen in Wood's affectionate and even reverent portrayal of his mother that is not found in Lee's blunt photograph of gnarled hands. Lee's photograph, again, let me back up. Not only that, but this also plays out in the vantage point. As Dennis observed, Wood used an elevated position that helps symbolize her exalted status as a farmer's wife and earthbound mother. Lee's photograph, in contrast, fragments the older woman and forces the viewer gaze down toward the earth. There is little reverence here. Rather, it is an image of forced recognition that confronts the viewer. Again, I'm quoting Elizabeth McCausland, the contemporary critic, who said this, quote, in the erosion of these deformed fingers is to be seen the symbol of social distortion and deformation. Waste is to be read here, as it is read in lands washed down by the sea, by floods, in dust storms, and in drought bowls, unquote. Lee's focus on Ostermeyer's knotted hands, in other words, was a well-crafted and powerful synecdoche that forced viewers to acknowledge a lifetime of labor, strain, and little rest. The fact that Lee encountered a different Iowa from the one projected by Wood was not a surprise. In 1935, the critic Lincoln Kirsten chastised Wood and the, quote, sweetness upon which his prestige is based. In Lee's series of couples, he created images that possessed an element of tragedy that did not hide the grim. Instead, his work revealed a harsh reality in human couples that viewers could understand and even desire to help. By the end of December, the biting chill and snow that swept across Iowa had dissipated. As Christmas approached in 1936, the weather became unseasonably warm, reaching temperatures of 65 degrees. The dirt roads had thawed, but Lee still lamented that the mud made the roads increasingly impassable. As he continued to work in the state, the warmer conditions made it easier to move around and to make photographs. but it did not hide the poverty. Lee did not spend Christmas Eve with his family or friends. In fact, his time on the road and his complete dedication to his new career was eroding his marriage to Doris. Rather, Lee stayed in Iowa and he investigated the area around Denison, which was hit particularly hard by drought and poverty. In a detailed letter to Stryker, written on December 24th, Lee outlined the difficulties and noted that many families were living on potatoes, bread, and gravy. One of the destitute families Lee visited was that of Earl Powley, who lived outside of the small town of Smithland. The Powleys were tenant farmers on 185 acres owned by a loan company. Their home burned down a couple years before Lee's visit and was replaced by a simple one-room dwelling dug into the hillside that was covered with repurposed cardboard for insulation against the cold. Lee photographed the young children as they played, in fact, curiously looked and watched the photographer and played with tumbleweeds in the warm weather and the shortened day. The photographs of the children, young children in near rags, would be central to this picture of destitution. Lee eventually gained access into the home and must have spent the entire afternoon with Powley and his wife and their 4 children. Inside, he photographed the youngest child in a dirty crib that consisted of a spring mattress with little cover and no padding. His most telling and probably touching photograph, however, shows the young children eating their Yuletide meal. It began an earlier photograph showing Earl Powley sitting at the table. But then, without the father, without Earl Powley, Lee, and possibly even at his request, the father stepped aside so that Lee could photograph the humble meal that consisted, as he says in his caption, of potatoes, cabbage, and pie, with the children standing as they ate. Lee's use of flash boldly reveals the details of their poverty, as well as the cat at the children's feet. In this photograph, Lee captured what might be the antithesis of a Christmas meal. So think of what you think of when you think of Christmas and a Christmas meal, and now compare that to this. It was exactly the type of image that Stryker could use to generate sympathy from American audience who would have had a higher and more idealized notion of what an important holiday meal should look like. In many ways, the photograph of the Powleys contrasts sharply with Doris Lee's depiction of a bustling and bountiful Thanksgiving meal, or even Wood's rosier picture of Iowan life. This is especially true when comparing the agrarian vision of his dinner for the threshers from 2 years earlier. Writing for the New York Times in 1934, the critic Edward Alden Jewell touted threshers as a noble portrait of rural America and the spirit of honest labor. Quoting Jewell here, quote, "Grant Wood has here produced an American document that is tender, deep, reverent, and altogether just. Fine in its sympathy, its understanding, beautiful in its spaciousness and dignity, and grave, unhurried pose," unquote. Although it highlights some of the humbler elements of rural life, this more idealized view of a Midwestern farm meal stands in sharp contrast to Lee's photograph, which possesses a different sense of tenderness, reverence, and sympathy in an altogether unhurried pose. It was a stark reminder of the real life conditions real life Iowans were enduring. It also confirms Stuart Davis' accusation that the regionalists, like Grant Wood's, quote, neglected factual observation to spin sugar-coated yarns about the wonderful meals farm help get in Iowa, unquote. After his work in Iowa, Lee returned to Illinois to the house of his mother-in-law. He didn't go home or to Washington, D.C., but remained in Iowa the following week and then traveled across the Midwest. For Stryker, Lee created what he believed was very excellent material, but he still had room for improvement. Writing to Russell Lee in January, Stryker provided a telling critique of his work in the Hawkeye State. Quote, "You have done many pictures of families standing in front of their house or shack," he wrote. "They appear a bit stiff, taken in this manner. These would be all right, provided we could show members of the same family in the house doing various things," unquote. In other words, Stryker seemed to be saying, do not follow Grant Wood's template and pose your subjects like American Gothic. Rather, Stryker wanted photographs that showed real people engaged in real life. Yet Stryker may have been too quick to criticize his new photographers. In important ways, Lee was able to balance Wood's visual efficacy and lyricism with a grit and poignancy of documentary photography to reveal the dire situations faced by many Iowans. Lee, by the time you get to the end of 1936 and 1937, Lee's transition to a photographer was complete. And he would go on from this point to be the most proficient, most prolific of all the FSA photographers. He would travel with Okies through the Midwest in the aftermath of the discussion of things like Grapes of Wrath. And he created over this period, not only the most photographs by any one photographer in the FSA archives, but many images which have become iconic, just like several of the other images that you've seen. And reveal, in fact, the full transition from a painter to a documentary photographer in the guise of people like Walker Evans and others. And yet Lee's work in Iowa in December turned out to be one of his most important series. The image of the image of the Powleys' Christmas dinner and Teresa Ostermeyer's Weather Hands reveal a depth and a sympathetic eye that was already present in his work, and would become two of his best known photographs. And I conclude this presentation with just a couple of observations. About 2.5 weeks ago, I was visiting the Museum of Modern Art and entered into the section that deals with the 1930s with FSA photography and regionalism. And I wasn't too surprised to see the images of Teresa Ostermeyer's hands there on the walls of this most important museum. It's also possible to see the influence of Lee and arguably his most famous image in the work of younger photographers, contemporary photographers like Holly Linton, whose image here clearly resonates with and responds to Russell Lee's photograph. And I end this too on a personal note. It was this photograph. I remember exactly where I was sitting in the library at my university during my undergraduate education when I saw this photograph, and it impacted me greatly. It, in fact, reinforced my interest in photography and reinvigorated me to understand who made this photograph and whose hands those belong to. And I hope in this presentation, I've been able to bring some of that information to light. So, folks, it's with that I thank you. And now I think we have time for questions and answers, if there are some.
Yeah, thank you, James. We have some time to answer some questions, but if you do have a question, please feel free to submit it through the Q&A feature here on Zoom. But please note, we may not be able to get to all of the questions today. So let's dig in. I think one question I thought about, and one was submitted, was, did Russell Lee and Grant Wood ever meet?
They surely did. Grant Wood, as I mentioned, was good friends with Doris, and they hung out all the time. We know they hung out all the time. There's documentary evidence that talks about them hanging out. As I said, Doris Lee was one of the last of friends to visit Grant Wood before he passed away in 1942. We know for sure that they would have been at this meeting in Thomas Hart Benton's apartment, I think in 1934. We have the list of people, and both Doris and Russell and Grant Wood are there. So yes, they would have not only known each other, but I would be surprised. Russell Lee was a very genial figure. Everyone I've talked to his students, I've talked to those who knew him, and he was one of the most friendly people that they know. And so I think with this information, it's fairly safe to say that he would have made that acquaintance.
Another question came in about Russell Lee's use of flash. Was he the only FSA photographer to work with flash?
He's most famously doing that. There are others who experiment with it to a certain degree. There are those famously who don't, namely Dorothea Lange, who really kind of hesitated and would much prefer to actually photograph people in natural light. Russell Lee, as a trained chemical engineer, though, was very interested in the technical side of photography. And once he embraced it, kind of makes this transition from painter to photographer, he becomes very quickly technically proficient in cameras, large format cameras, small handheld cameras. He becomes very interested in flash technology. And so he starts to utilize that quicker and actually uses it far more than any other FSA photographer. You will see others using it, but nowhere near as much as Russell Lee.
Another question about the process. A question comes up: did Lee travel back home to develop the film and images, or was there a way from the process to film on the road?
Great question. So how it worked was this: the lab was back in Washington, D.C. in the New Deal offices, in the offices of the Resettlement Administration and later the Farm Security Administration. Stryker sets up an entire darkroom there. He has, I think it's about 15 technicians. So what the photographers would do is they would shoot, right, and then send the rolls of film back to Washington. That's where they would be developed. Stryker would sometimes send the images back to the photographers so they can kind of see what was going on. He would give them advice, technical advice, and then he would also ask them to caption them. So it's at that point when they got the images back that they would write down the captions, largely taken from their notes and from their field notes. So yeah, it's interesting. So Lee was taking all these photographs, and it would sometimes be months before he would actually see them and see how well he was doing. If they had camera problems, this was particularly bad because they could go for weeks without knowing that their film was being spoiled. Often Stryker would call him up or send him a letter saying, this is going on. But yeah, that was the kind of the time lag between those two.
I'm kind of jumping to Wood's work a little bit. Since Wood oversaw Iowa's PWAP projects, Andrea is wondering if you could talk about Wood's mural designs in relation to Lee's photographs, specifically as propaganda.
Yeah, that's a good question. And I'll have to admit, I do know of the Wood's PWAP work, but I don't know it as well. I think in putting together this article years ago, but I'm a little hesitant to speak to it today. But many of those same themes obviously are there with Wood. The fertile fields and the stout farmers and their families. I mean, those themes obviously continue. I would hesitate to go further than that without kind of having to delve in a little bit more. But kind of with this larger point, the PWAP, WPA, they were very interested in projecting this idea of farming, the virtue of farming. And so those virtues that you see in those murals are found not just in Iowa, but elsewhere throughout the United States. And especially from 1937 onward, are also resonating with Stryker and his photographers. So yeah, good question. And I'd love to know more. And I think it's worth looking into.
Well, connecting to the WPA, a question came in about how WPA, the effort is hiring artists, who needed work. Lee was an independent, had an income as a large farm owner and didn't need the income. So how did Lee get involved?
So again, this takes place kind of when he's realizing, look, I'm a crappy artist. And he's pretty crappy when it comes to his painting. And so he starts to he picks up a camera, starts making pictures. And then it was through Ben Shahn, the important American painter. Shahn was also working for Stryker. And so Ben Shahn tipped Lee on to the project and actually endorsed him and basically set up this opportunity to meet Stryker. And then through Joe Jones, another regionalist painter who was aware of Stryker's work, he encouraged Lee to go and talk to him as well. So these circles were small, and they all could see what was coming out of Washington. And especially when Lee was trying to figure out who he was and what he could do, it just seemed to be a perfect fit. And in hindsight, it really was. I mean, Stryker and Lee hit it off instantly. They become really close friends as well as collaborators. And so, yeah, that's just kind of how it starts.
You mentioned this a little bit, but can you kind of go on about how did Lee's photographs impact the aid that was provided to Iowa?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the Resettlement Administration and Stryker's historical section realized they needed good propaganda. They needed to show that there was a need. And so what Stryker would do is he'd gather these images and then he would send them off to places like the New York Times or the Des Moines Register. and they would produce and print them. So it was really kind of this act of PR that by supplying these images to show, well, a couple of things. One, how bad the situation was and how New Deal programs were helping, that they would use those to get the word out and basically provide just good PR, or in other words, good propaganda for their New Deal agency that would then secure their funding through Congress and allow them to do other things. Because we have to also remember that a lot of these programs were controversial, especially the Resettlement Administration. And so there was constant pushback, and even constant pushback on Stryker. And so they're always having to justify what it is that they were doing. And by producing good photographs, that enable them to keep working.
And this will be our last question for today. How can people access the photos you showed today?
Great question. Everything that was produced by these photographers, by the photographers working for the Resettlement Administration, the Farm Security Administration, another administration called the War Office of Information, they're all kept together, and they're all kept in the Library of Congress. So there's a couple things. In the old days, you'd have to go back, and they have these giant filing cabinets in the photography, what's it called? Photography, the office there. And you could actually pull them out and look at them. Wonderfully, since the mid-1990s, the Library of Congress has been digitizing these images and putting them online. So if you just Google FSA OWI photography, you will see a link come up from the Library of Congress. There's even a search engine, right, where you could just type in a county, a city, a state, a photographer, and it will literally search through the more than 270,000 images and give you all the results. It's a wonderful way of being able to look at all this information, be able to look at all these images. And the other thing I would just add to this, it's all in the public domain. So you will see that when you pull up this information, right, pull up these images from the Library of Congress webpage, you can actually download them as high quality JPEGs or high quality TIFFs that you could basically blow up to be the size of a wall, right, if you really wanted to. Again, it's all coming through the New Deal. It's all property of the Library of Congress, and then as such, it's all part of the public domain.
Well, thank you. With that answer, we'll bring this webinar to a close. Thank you to everyone for joining us today. And we'd like to extend one last thank you to our presenter, James. We hope everyone will sign up for the Iowa History 101 webinars that take place on the second and fourth Thursdays throughout the year. There are many great stories to tell in the upcoming months. Now, for more information and to register for future webinars in this series, please check out our website at iowaculture.gov. This webinar and past presentations are also available on our website. And while you're there, you can look in some other our programs we have, such as our Goldie's Kids Club activities from historians. We look forward to virtually seeing you here again for the next Iowa History 101 webinar, the second on March 23rd. Forgive me. Thank you all for joining us again today, and have a great afternoon. Thanks.